Thank you all for joining us today. During this webinar, we will be covering bumblebee ID in the Midwestern United States. Today is part one of a three-part webinar series. So over the course of these three webinars, we will be covering most of the bumblebee species that you can find in this region. Today, we are going to be going through an overview of bumblebee morphology and introducing you to some of the common species that you might encounter in the Midwestern United States, the common eastern bumblebee, the two-spotted bumblebee, and the brown-belted bumblebee. And then we'll also be introducing you to a few less common species, the halfback bumblebee, Sanderson's bumblebee, and the perplexing bumblebee. And then I would like to just thank our partners who help us run the atlas in the various states that we are in, as well as our folks at University of Minnesota and at Mizzou, Elaine and Elise, or sorry, Jared and Elise, thank you so much for helping out today. And thank you to our partners at University of Minnesota for contributing to this slideshow as well. All right, so just a quick outline of topics that we're going to be covering today. I want to give you guys a brief overview of bumblebee anatomy before we get into the BID component, just to get you guys familiar with some terminology, the different parts of the bumblebees. I also want to spend a little bit of time discussing how you differentiate between male and female bumblebees, because we're going to be talking about ID for both males and females of the species that we're going to cover today. And then lastly, we are going to be going through an overview of identification for those 6 species that I mentioned earlier. All right, so let's jump into bumblebee anatomy. So we can think of bumblebees as having 3 major parts of their bodies: their head, their thorax, which is where their legs and their wings attach. Bumblebees have 3 pairs of legs. They have forelegs, mid legs, and hind legs. And they also have 2 sets of wings, so they have 4 wings in total. And then the last part of the bee's body that we are going to be spending a lot of time discussing is the abdomen. So the abdomen is segmented. It is in 6 segments for females and 7 segments for males. Each one of these segments is called a tergite, and they are numbered. The closest tergite to the thorax is called T1. The next one is called T2, so on and so forth. All right, so there are lots of different features on the head, thorax, and abdomen that I want to give you guys an overview of. So we can start off with the head. So the first thing I like to look at when I'm looking at the bumblebee's head, when I'm working through identifications, is the color of the hair on the bumblebee's face. So where the 2 antennae attach on their head, as well as the colors of the hairs on the vertex or the top of their head. The next thing I like to look at is what is called the malar space of the bumblebee's face. And this is just a fancy word for cheek. The different bumblebee species have different lengths of cheeks. So some bumblebees have a really long cheek, some bumblebees have a shorter cheek, and some bumblebees have a moderately lengthed cheek. The example you see here has a moderately length cheeked. So the length of the cheek is approximately the same size as the width of the cheek. Just to give you guys a visual of what a long-cheeked and a short-cheeked bumblebee look like, we see here a bumblebee that has a longer cheek, and that gives it a sort of horsey face. At the bottom here, we see a bumblebee with a shorter cheek. So this bee has a somewhat rounder face. It has a pretty short cheek. The next feature that can be helpful to look at for some species is the antenna. So bumblebees have jointed antennae, which have segments as well. And these segments are called flagellum. For some species, you need to look at the length of certain segments on their antenna to be able to differentiate them to species. The next feature that I like to look at on the head of the bee are the positions of the compound eyes compared to the ocelli. So these two large eyes here are the compound eyes of the bee, and then the ocelli are the three little eyes here on top. Right, now we can move on to the thorax. So the thorax of the bee is where the wings attach. So as I mentioned previously, bumblebees have four wings. They have two pairs of wings. And where they attach to the thorax is referred to as the wing joint. We can break up the thorax into different parts. So this front part here of the thorax is called the scutum. The back part is called the scutellum. Uh, this middle part in between the two wing joints is part of the scutum. We can refer to that as the inner alar space. We often look at different color patterns on these different parts of the thorax when we're trying to differentiate bumblebees to different species. Okay. And the last thing I want to mention is that abdomen. When we are identifying bumblebees to species, often what we're looking at is different color patterns on the different segments or tergites of the abdomen. As I mentioned previously, these tergites are numbered. We have tergite number 1, which is closest to the bumblebee's thorax, and then we just number them down until the end of the bee. So that is our basic overview of bumblebee anatomy. And before we get into the BID portion, I just want to talk a little bit about how you generally differentiate male and female bumblebees from each other. When differentiating males and females, we look at a few key characteristics. The first thing that I always check is whether or not a bumblebee has a pollen basket on their hind leg. For females, bumblebees that aren't cuckoo bumblebees, they will have a pollen basket on their hind leg. So that middle part of their leg has an area where they will like to pack all of their pollen that they're collecting. And this middle section has a sort of triangular shape to it. You can really see that here in this image on the left. The female bumblebee has this triangular shaped area that doesn't have any hairs. It's quite smooth and shiny, and that's the area where she'll pack her pollen. For males, they don't have a pollen basket, so their legs have a more spindly look to them. They're thinner. They don't have that triangular shape of that middle section of the leg. It's a little bit round on the bottom and it's sort of hairy all the way through. So when I'm differentiating between males and females, that's the first thing that I look at. And then just as a heads up, for cuckoo bumblebees, the females don't have pollen baskets either. So this is not a surefire way to differentiate between males and females of all species, but it's true for most. The next thing I will check is the number of segments of the abdomen. As I alluded to earlier, female bumblebees have 6 abdominal segments or tergites. Males will have 7. And sometimes it's really hard to count the number of segments on the bee's abdomen because the last few segments are kind of tiny. But if you have a really good photo, sometimes you can count the number of segments that makes up the abdomen, and you can differentiate between males and females that way. Male and female bumblebees also differ in terms of the number of segments that they have on their antenna. Female bumblebees have 10 of these antennal segments, and male bumblebees will have 11. On occasion, when I am going through photos submitted to Bumblebee Watch, I can actually see the stinger of the bumblebee. And in that case, I always know that it's a female because female bumblebees have stingers while male bumblebees don't. And for this reason, you can actually handle male bumblebees without worrying about being stung. It's safe to hold them without any risk of that. With the females, you may want to hold them while they're on a flower or something because they can sting you. The stinger is actually a modified ovipositor, so that's the reason that females have stingers and males don't. The next thing I'd like to check is whether or not the bee has enlarged eyes. For some species of bumblebees, the females will have normal-sized eyes, whereas the males will have really large eyes. So as you can see in this example, This female bumblebee has, regular sized eyes. They're nothing super huge. Whereas the male counterpart has very large eyes. The last thing I use, just kind of as a general rule of thumb, is that females tend to be a little bit more well-groomed looking for some species, as opposed to males, which can look a little bit shaggier. And they also tend to have more yellow hairs on, especially the bottom of their body and on the front of their face than females. And that's not true for all species, but it is true for many. Right, and now we can jump into BID. So as I mentioned previously, we're going to be talking about identification for 6 different bumblebee species in the Midwestern United States. The first 3 that we're going to be talking about, the common eastern bumblebee, the two-spotted bumblebee, the brown-belted bumblebee, are super, super common. The other 3, the half-black bumblebee, Sanderson's bumblebee, and the perplexing bumblebee, are less common, but you will encounter them in some regions of the Midwestern United States. So to start off, let's talk about the common eastern bumblebee, Bombus impatiens. So true to its name, the common eastern bumblebee is one of the most commonly encountered bumblebees in the East. You will find this bumblebee species in Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Kansas. In the Great Plains region, you'll often find them more frequently on the eastern side of the state because this is an eastern species. As you move westward, you sort of move outside of its native range. Whenever I try to identify a bumblebee, I always like to work backwards. So the first thing I always look at is the bee's abdomen. For the common eastern bumblebee, their abdomen is mostly black, right? All of the tergites are completely black except for that first one, T1, which is yellow. As we move up the bee, I like to look at the thorax next. So for the common eastern bumblebee, the thorax is completely yellow except for a teardrop shape or a circle of black in between the 2 wing joints. And you can really see that teardrop shape here. We don't see a black dot so much as we see this sort of faded teardrop shape with almost a line going down the middle where we can see the exoskeleton of the bee underneath the hairs. The next thing I like to check is the hair color on the front of the face and the top of the head of the bee, just to make sure it's aligning with what I would expect. For female common eastern bumblebees, those hairs are black on the front of the face and then yellow on the top of the head. A couple other things to look out for this species is the coloration. In general, common eastern bumblebees tend to be a paler, sort of yellow, and they have pretty transparent wings. It's almost like looking through a window. You can see from this example image that this bumblebee, you can see right through its wings. Underneath, you can clearly see that the tergites are yellow and black, even though that wing is blocking the way. The color patterns of the males, very similar. The abdomen is completely black except for T1, which is yellow. The thorax is yellow with a black circle or teardrop in the center. And then on the head, the hairs are yellow on the top of the head and then yellow on the face. So that's different than the females. You can see here this little patch of yellow hairs. That's a nice cue that this is likely a male. I kind of think of it as being their little mustache that they have. Just to give you guys a couple more examples to look at, from these 2 bumblebees, we can clearly see the color patterns on the thorax and the abdomen. We see a mostly black thorax with a band of yellow on T1, and then, a mostly black abdomen with T1 yellow, and then the thorax mostly yellow with a dot of black or a teardrop shape in the middle. We see a similar pattern on the second bee. We can't quite see what's going on with T2, but we can see that T1 is black or T1 is yellow, and that the thorax has that nice teardrop shape that we would expect for Bombus impatiens. Here are some examples of male Bombus impatiens or common eastern bumblebees. So you can see here that the males have that mostly black abdomen with T1 yellow, and then their thorax is mostly yellow. In this photo to your left, you can also see that the hairs on the front of the face of this bee are yellow. And from this side angle view, you can also get a really good look at the leg of this bee. You can see that it's quite spindly. There's no evidence of a pollen basket there at all. It's got sort of more of a roundish shape in that middle section of the hind leg. So that's another thing to look out for when you're trying to differentiate between males and females of this species. All right, moving on to our next species on the docket, the two-spotted bumblebee, Bombus bimaculatus. This is another really widespread species that you'll find across much of the Midwest. This species gets its name because of this two-spot pattern on its abdomen, on T2. You can also think of this as being sort of a W shape. So working backwards from the abdomen to the head, the two-spotted bumblebee has a mostly black abdomen with that two-spot or W pattern on T2, yellow on T1, and then a mostly yellow thorax with a black dot in between the two wing joints. And then on the head, they have mostly black hairs on their face and then yellow hairs on the top of their head. This bumblebee is a nice yellow color, I would call it a yellow. And it has transparent wings, which tend to be a little bit darker than Bombus impatiens wings, but there is a lot of variability between individuals. That's just sort of a general rule of thumb that they have somewhat darker wings than Bombus impatiens. So males, very similar color pattern to the females, although they do tend to be a lot more variable, especially on the color patterns on the abdomen. So working backwards from the abdomen to the head, male two-spotted bumblebees also have yellow on T1. They will have yellow on T2. You'll often see that W shape on T2 on the males as well. Although sometimes for males, this W shape is not super distinct. In this example here, we see that rather than having a distinct W shape, this male just has some dark hairs on the side of that segment of the abdomen. And that is pretty typical, or not super typical, but you will often see it for this species. They can also have variable color patterns on the other segments of their abdomen. So you will often see some yellow on T4 and 5. Usually T3 will be mostly black, but you'll see some sort of zebra striping on the rest of their abdomen. But two-spotted bumblebee males can be a little bit tricky to identify sometimes. Just to give you guys a look at what some of these bees look like. For our two-spotted bumblebee females, we see that nice W shape there on T2. T1 is yellow, and then we have a thorax that is mostly yellow with a dot of black in the middle. From this second photo, you can also see that the hairs on the top of the head are quite yellow on that vertex. There is a lot of variability in the size of that W pattern in females. Sometimes you'll get a really nice example of a female bumblebee with a very distinct W shape. Other times it will not be as distinct and it will look almost more like a little crescent. So something to watch out for when you are trying to identify these bumblebees to species. You won't always see that very distinct W shape. Looking at males, we also see some variability in the distinctness of that W shape. Some bees have a nice distinct little W on T2. Others will have a less distinct W, and you'll just see mostly black hairs on the sides of that abdominal segment. But looking at the rest of this bee, we see that the thorax is mostly yellow with a black dot in the center between the wing joints. We see the yellow hairs on the top of the head. And if we were looking at the front of the face of this bee, we would see some yellow hairs as well. Another example of a male, this one has a bit more yellow. We see that T1 is completely yellow. T2 is mostly yellow, but there are some dark patches on the sides of this abdominal segment. T3 is black, and then we have some yellow hairs on T4 and T5. So this is a color pattern that you will on occasion encounter for Bombus bimaculatus, males specifically. Some folks will get the two-spotted bumblebee and the common eastern bumblebee mixed up when they are starting to learn how to identify bumblebees. When we say that this bee has this W shape on its abdomen, a lot of the times folks will think that that means that this first segment of the abdomen, that it kind of has this swooping shape. But when we are talking about that W, we are referring to the second segment of the abdomen. So we can see here that both of these bees, T1 is yellow, but on that second segment of the abdomen for the two-spotted bumblebee, we have that two-spotted or W-shaped pattern. Another thing to keep in mind is that on occasion, you will see a common eastern bumblebee with some yellow hairs on T2, just a few. This isn't a super common morph, but you will see it sometimes, especially for males. They will sometimes just have 5 or 10, or sometimes even more than 5 or 10 hairs on T2. And that can be a little bit confusing, especially when you're comparing it to two-spotted bumblebees that don't have a very distinct W shape. So something to keep in mind as well. One thing I like to look out for when I'm looking at bees like this is the color pattern on the thorax. Two-spotted bumblebees often have a nice dot, whereas the common eastern bumblebees have more of that teardrop shape. Right, moving on to our next species, the brown-belted bumblebee, Bombus griseocollis. This is another widespread species that you will see very frequently in the Midwestern United States. It's called the brown-belted bumblebee because it has a brown belt or crescent on T2. So working backwards from the abdomen to the head, this bee has a mostly black abdomen. It has yellow on T1, and then T2 has that crescent of reddish orange, brown or golden brown hairs. So they can be quite variable in the color. The thorax of this bee is yellow. It has a dot between its two wing joints of black in the center. And then the head has black hairs on the face and then black hairs on the top of the head. This bee also has short, even hairs. So Bombus bimaculatus, the two-spotted bumblebee that we just went over, tends to have shaggier hairs than this bee species. It almost looks like it has a buzz cut, especially on the thorax of the bee. This bumblebee species also tends to have slightly darker wings, especially when compared to the common eastern bumblebee that has those really transparent wings. For the males look pretty similar to the females. They have a mostly black abdomen with a crescent of brown or yellow or orangish brown on T2, and then T1 mostly yellow. They have a thorax that's yellow with a black circle in the center. And the thing that's really distinct about brown-belted bumblebee males is what's going on with their head. So they have yellow hairs on their top of their head and on the front of the face, but they also have really large eyes. So one thing to look out for when you are looking at male bumblebees is for those large eyes, because that's a good cue that you're looking at a brown-belted bumblebee when you are trying to differentiate it between common eastern and two-spotted bumblebees. So just to give you guys a look at some more examples, here we have some examples of the abdomen of some brown-belted bumblebee females. You can really see that crescent shape of brown here. This bumblebee has a mostly black abdomen, but you can see that T1 is yellow, and then T2, where that crescent is, has that brownish crescent of hairs. There is a lot of variability in that color pattern, or the sort of saturation of the brown hairs on T2. For some examples, you might see bees that have really more of a golden color pattern there. And sometimes that's because their hairs have faded or just because they are a lighter morph. The width of this crescent can vary quite a bit. So here we see some examples of two different females. This first female has quite a wide crescent of brownish orange hairs. The second female has a smaller crescent. It gets really narrow here, especially as you approach the edges of the abdominal segment. The number of hairs really tapers off. One thing I like to look out for when I'm looking at brown-belted bumblebee females is a few brown hairs on the sides of the abdominal segment T2. You can really see that here. There are quite a few brownish hairs on T2, and that's a good cue that it is a brown-belted bumblebee as opposed to a two-spotted bumblebee, because two-spotted bumblebees the crescent or the two-spotted pattern will not extend so far out towards the edges of the abdominal segment. There is some variability in the hair color patterns on the face as well. Oftentimes you will have bees with completely dark faces and dark hairs on the top of the head, but sometimes you'll see some morphs with some lighter hairs sort of in the under pile. So watch out for that as well. Just to give you guys some examples of males, we have two males here. As I mentioned previously, the color pattern is very similar for males and females of brown-belted bumblebees. The abdomen is mostly dark. You have a crescent of reddish-brown hairs on T2. Sorry, my mouse is being a little bit slow. You have that crescent of brownish hairs on T2, and then you have yellow on T1, and then you have a yellow thorax with a dot of black in the center. And the thing to really look out here is those large eyes for the brown-belted bumblebee males. Brown-belted bumblebee males, as I alluded to previously, can be a little easy to confuse with two-spotted bumblebees, especially for brown-belted bumblebees that don't have a really nice orange or dark saturated color on T2. So things to look out for when you're separating out these species is the length of the hair. Brown-belted bumblebees tend to have shorter, more close cropped looking hair than the two-spotted bumblebee, which tends to be a bit shaggier. The second thing I like to look out for is how far those yellow hairs on T2 extend towards the edges of the segment. For the brown-belted bumblebee, you won't really see yellow hairs extending all the way to the edge, as you often will see for the brown-belted bumblebee. You can also look at the faces of these bees. So for the two-spotted bumblebee, they have a really long malar space. They have a long horsey-ish looking face. So you can really see how long that cheek length is here. For the brown-belted bumblebee, they have a shorter face. So they have a rounder looking face, a short cheek, and I also like to look at the hairs on the top of the head, which are not visible here, but brown-belted bumblebees have dark hairs generally on the top of their head. Two-spotted bumblebees, excuse me, two-spotted bumblebees will have light hairs on their vertex. Another tip for identifying bumblebees is to make sure you watch out for bumblebees that have lost a lot of hairs. Sometimes when you look at the abdomen and you think that it's mostly dark all the way through, it could be because that's the color of the hair pattern, or it could be because it's lost a lot of hair. So when a bee has lost a lot of hair, sometimes you won't ever be able to identify it to species. But keep in mind that just because it looks dark doesn't necessarily mean that it is dark. You really need to look at the colors of the hair, not the exoskeleton underneath. All right, the next bumblebee on the docket is the half-black bumblebee, Bombus vagans. So this is a bumblebee that you will find often in the upper Midwest. It becomes harder to find as you move south and west. So this is a bumblebee that gets its name from its color pattern on its abdomen. Once again, we have on the abdomen two stripes of yellow. T1 is yellow and T2 is yellow, and then the rest of the abdomen is black. Like most of the other species that we've discussed, the thorax of this bee is yellow, but it has a circle of black in the center. Sometimes it's more of an oval shape. And then on the head, there are black hairs on the front of the face and then yellow hairs on the top. This bumblebee species tends to be a little bit on the shaggier side. It has long, somewhat uneven looking hair. The males of this species are very similar to the females. We have on the abdomen it's mostly black, but T1 and T2 are completely yellow. The thorax is yellow with a black spot in the center, and then the hairs on the top of the head are yellow. One thing to look out for, like many of the males that we've discussed today, are yellow hairs. This bee species tends to have yellow hairs on the front of the face for males. Just to give you guys some examples to look at, we have a half black bumblebee female here. You can clearly see that the thorax of the bee is yellow with a dark circle in the center between the two wing joints. T1 is yellow and T2 is completely yellow, and the rest of the bee is black. We also see some yellow hairs on the vertex or the top of the head of the bee, and then dark hairs on the front of the face. For males, once again, similar color patterning. We have T1, T2 yellow on the abdomen. The rest of the abdomen is black. The thorax is mostly yellow with a spot of yellow in the middle. And then from this image, we can see that the hairs on the top of the head are yellow and the front of the face are yellow. This bee, you can also see that there are lots of yellow hairs on the underside of the bee, as well as on the sides of those black segments of the abdomen, and that's something you'll often see for Bombus vagans males. Right. Bombus vagans is very, very similar looking to Sanderson's bumblebee. Their color patterning is almost exactly the same. Sanderson's bumblebee is not a bumblebee that you'll encounter in many regions in the Midwestern United States. We mostly find it in northern Minnesota, but if you are doing any BID in this region, please keep in mind that these two species are really hard to tell apart. So Sanderson's bumblebee, as I mentioned, very similar color pattern to the half-black bumblebee. This bumblebee has a black abdomen with T1 and T2 yellow. The thorax of the bee is yellow. It will have a black dot or oval or sometimes almost complete black band between the two wing joints. And that's not something you can use to differentiate it completely from the half-black bumblebee because the color patterning can be similar for the half-black bumblebee. But Sanderson's bumblebee generally tends to have more black hairs between the two wing joints. For the head, the front of the face is black for females, and the top of the head can be variable. Sometimes it can be completely black. Sometimes there will be some yellow hairs in there. So it just depends on the individual you're looking at. Very similar color patterns for males. The males are quite similar to the females. The abdomen is mostly black, with the exception of T1 and T2, which are completely yellow. The thorax is yellow with a black dot or oval or band in the center. And then the head of this bee will have yellow hairs on the top of the head and yellow hairs on the face for the males. Just to give you guys some examples to look at, we have an example of a female Sanderson's bumblebee here. And you can see that the hairs on the abdomen are black with the exception of T1 and T2, which are yellow. We also see that the thorax of this bee is mostly yellow except for there's almost a complete black band between the two wing joints. Then we can see that the hairs on the top of the head are black and that the hairs on the front of the face are black. For males, really similar color patterning with this example. We see that the abdomen is mostly black, with the exception of T1 and T2, which are completely yellow. We also see some yellow hairs on T5, which is something you'll see on occasion with this bumblebee species. The thorax is yellow, and then we also see a oval of black in between the two wing joints, and then yellow hairs on the top of the head and the front of the face. So the only way to be 100% sure you're differentiating between these two species is by looking at the face, the malar space length for the females, and then the antenna for the males. So for half-black bumblebee and Sanderson's bumblebee females, you want to get a really good photo of the malar space. For half-black bumblebees, they have a really long malar space. Sanderson's bumblebee has a moderate malar space, so the malar space is about as long as it is wide. And honestly, like looking at these two pictures, I can't see a ton of a difference. You really have to measure them to be sure. So for our half-black bumblebee, we have a really long face. And then the width of the face is a little bit shorter than the length. For Sanderson's, we have the width a little bit longer than the length here. So that's the only way you can be 100% sure you're differentiating, or you're 100% sure you're looking at a half-black versus a Sanderson's bumblebee is by measuring that cheek. For the males, the only way you can be 100% sure that you're differentiating between them is by looking at the antenna. So as I mentioned previously, the segments of the antenna are called flagellum. So this third segment here, F3, for the half-black bumblebee, it tends to be, or it is twice as long as it is wide. For Sanderson's bumblebee, it's about 1.5 times as long as it is wide. So not a ton of difference there, but you need to measure that segment of the flagellum or look to see if there are hairs on the antenna on those first 3 segments on the underside. If there are hairs, then that is the cue that you have Sanderson's bumblebee. If there are no hairs, then you have a half-black bumblebee. So just for you guys to visualize that, here we have a half-black bumblebee antenna, and you can see that this bee does not have any hairs on the underside of the antenna, and that the third segment of the antenna is twice as long approximately as it is wide. For the Sanderson's bumblebee, you can see some hairs there. So those are the hairs that I was referring to on the other side of the antenna. And then when you look at this segment, it looks a bit shorter than the segment for the half-black bumblebee. If we were to measure it, it would be about 1.5 times as long as it is wide. So the only way, just to reiterate, to separate out these two species and be sure is by looking at the face length for the females or for at the antenna for the males.
Can I add one thing, Jenny, before we jump into
Yes.
Perplexus? You showed those nice maps when we started talking about the half-black bumblebee and Sanderson's bumblebee. Sanderson's bumblebee has a much smaller range. So it's found mostly in northern Minnesota. So generally when you're in, so I'm in Minnesota, that's kind of where I'm thinking of things. So in southern Minnesota and then in other parts of Iowa and into Nebraska, etc. You can kind of think of those as like vagans safe zones or safe zones for the half-black bumblebee. So you really only need to be concerned about looking at the malar space and those antennal segments when you're in Minnesota.
That's such a great point. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, just to showcase that again, really the species is found in northern Minnesota. You don't need to worry about it in Iowa, Missouri, some of the other states. All right. So excitingly, we are going to talk about perplexing bumblebee next, which I'm pretty excited about because this is one of my favorite bumblebee species. So once again, this is a species that you're not going to find across the entire Midwest. We see it pretty often in Minnesota and sort of the upper Midwest, but it's not found in Missouri. We might find it in Iowa. If you are somebody who is in Iowa, please keep an eye out for this species. It's one we think could be there, but we're not 100% sure. So the perplexing bumblebee gets its name because it is hard to identify. It's perplexing or confusing to ID to species because it has really highly variable color patterns. So sort of working from the abdomen to the head, the abdomen of this bee can have a lot of yellow, it can have less yellow. It really just depends on the bumblebee. For the females, generally, you'll see T1 and T2 with yellow or some yellow. T3 sometimes will have yellow. And then T5 will sometimes have a little bit of white at the very edge at the bottom. The thorax of this bee is somewhat distinct from some of the other bumblebee species you might encounter. It doesn't have any black hairs in between the wing joints. So unlike some of the other species where you'll see a spot or a band of black, this bumblebee species will be solidly colored yellow in between the wings. And then often you will see black hairs underneath the wing joints. And the amount of black hair underneath the wing joints can be quite variable. Sometimes you'll see lots and lots of black hairs. Sometimes you'll just see a few towards the bottom of the thorax. So it just depends on the individual you're looking at. But it is a nice cue that you're looking at a Bombus perplexus if you see a lot of black hairs like that. And then for the hair color pattern on the face, female bees tend to have black hairs on the front of the face, yellow hairs on the vertex or the top of the head. And then another thing to look out for with this species is the fact that they have really long, uneven, shaggy hair, even shaggier than some of the other species that we've mentioned here today. They also have a really lemony or really highly saturated kind of mustardy yellow coloration. And this coloration can fade a bit as the bees age specifically. And there's also some variation in individuals. Some can be darker, some can be lighter. But often if I see a bee that's this really bright, saturated color and I'm in Minnesota, one of the first things I think of is perplexus. The males have a similar color patterning to the females. Once again, they are highly variable. So the abdomen of the bee can be completely yellow in some cases. In general, you'll see T1 and T2 with all yellow, and then T3 with some yellow or all yellow. And then you may see yellow on T4 through 7. It just depends on the bumblebee that you're looking at. This example here, we see yellow on T1, we see yellow T2, yellow T3, and then some yellow on T4. The thorax of the bumblebee male for this species is solidly yellow. You won't see any black hairs at all between the wing joints. In general, you also won't see black hairs underneath the wings either. For this species, it tends to be solidly yellow for the males, although this bee does have a few yellow hairs, or sorry, black hairs underneath the wing joints here. So sometimes you'll see some for the males. The hair color patterns on the head for this species are yellow on the top and then yellow on the front of the face as well. So just to give you guys some examples to look at, this is a Bombus perplexus female. We have a all yellow thorax here, and you might think that this is a spot of black hairs here in the middle. It looks dark, but this is not actually hairs. It's just looking underneath at the exoskeleton of the bee. It's black, so it looks a little bit black, but if you look closely, you won't see any hairs themselves that are black, and you can really see that here in this second image. We can also see that the hairs underneath the wing joints are dark. So this bumblebee has quite a few dark hairs underneath its wing joints. This bumblebee has mostly yellow hairs on T1 and T2. We can see that there are a few black hairs on the sides of T2 for this bee, and that the rest of the bee is black. For some females of this species, as I mentioned, they will have some white hairs on T5 sometimes, but oftentimes they won't. So it just depends on the individual you're looking at. You can also see in the second image that this bee has some yellow hairs on the top of its head, black hairs on the front of its face. Here we have a couple examples of males. So this first male, once again, you can see that there are no black hairs on the thorax between the wing joints. It's solidly yellow. And then T1 and T2 of this bee, oops, sorry, lost my clicker. T1 and T2 of this bee are yellow. And then on T3, we have some yellow hairs as well, although they don't extend all the way across this segment. There are just a few in the center here. This second bee has a slightly different color pattern. It is yellow on T1, T2, and then T3 is completely yellow. And then we have a few yellow hairs on T4. So, this is a species that has pretty variable color patterning on the abdomen. The one thing I really like to look out for is that color pattern on the bee's thorax. So we really don't see a distinct dot here at all. The color is solid. It's solidly yellow. I find that it's pretty hard to differentiate between Bombus perplexus and Bombus bimaculatus, the two-spotted bumblebee, on some occasions because their color patterns can look similar at first glance. So here we have a Bombus perplexus. We see that it is yellow on the thorax. It's got yellow on T1, and that T2 is yellow in the middle, but there's black on the sides. And from this side view angle, it looks similar to a two-spotted bumblebee. So we see that yellow thorax on the two-spotted bumblebee, yellow on T1, and then yellow in the middle of T2 with black on the sides. The things to look out for here is that dark color on the side of the thorax. So for Bombus perplexus, we have dark hairs underneath the wing joint. For Bombus bimaculatus, the two-spotted bumblebee, we have light hairs there. It can also be easy to confuse Bombus perplexus with half-black bumblebees. The things to look out for there are, once again, the hair colors underneath the wing joints. It's a little hard to see from this picture, but this perplexing bumblebee has dark hairs underneath the wing joints. And then when we compare that to the half-black bumblebee, we see that it has light hairs underneath the wing joints. We also want to look again at that thorax, what's going on between the wing joints. The perplexing bumblebee won't have any black hairs there. It will be solidly yellow. The half-black bumblebee, we see from this example, this one has some black hairs there. Right, this is a black spot that features hairs. It's not solidly yellow. So two things to look out there. Oh, and I apologize. I just realized that this is confusing and perplexing. Both of those common names are used for Bombus perplexus. It's a confusing bee, and I made it slightly more confusing, I think, by using two different names for it. But both of those names refer to Bombus perplexus. I apologize, guys, if you found that hard to get around. Okay, so I think that pretty much covers everything I wanted to talk about today. I wanted to say once again, thank you all for being here with us. If you have any questions about any of the content of this presentation, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm super happy to answer any of your questions that you have. And I would like to thank all of our partners on this Bumblebee Atlas for helping us put together content like this for you, and for our partners at Mizzou and at University of Minnesota for helping me run this event today. I also want to say thank you to all of the folks out there who are watching, who are members of Xerces. A lot of the work that we do depends on the support of our members. So if you're interested in joining our movement, please check out our website. We really depend on all of your support in making this work possible. And I think we may have a little bit of time for questions. So I'm going to stop my screen share and I want to shout out to Jared and Elise. Did you guys see anything posted in the Q&A that you want to go over?
Uh, there was one person who asked about B machine, which I think is could be fun to talk about for a second. So for folks who don't know, B machine is an AI that can identify bees. Sometimes it does a really good job, but most of the time it's not always super spot on. But I think it can be used as a tool, just as a lot of other AI can. So sometimes if you're really, really stumped on a bee, don't know where to start, it doesn't really hurt to kind of plug it into B Machine in that case, because B Machine will give you usually a few different options for what the bumblebee could be. And sometimes just seeing, oh, well, the AI thinks it's this, maybe I should look at that, can help get you started. So I think in that case, it can be a really great tool when you're getting started with Bumblebee ID, but I don't think it's reliable when it comes to figuring out what bumblebee you're looking at.
That was a really well thought out answer, Elise.
Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree. If anybody has any specific questions, we do have a few minutes here. So if you have something you would like us to answer, please post it to the Q&A.
There's a question that just came in the Q&A of on my post analysis of my surveys, what I thought were females were called workers. Can you explain? It's a good question. So the bumblebee colonies, they're social insects. They have a caste system. So there's the queen, and then there's the workers, and then there are males. But the queen and the workers are all females. So identifying them or setting them as workers in Bumblebee Watch is kind of just a more specific version of saying they are females. So you were correct if you put them in as females. Workers just puts them into that specific caste.
For a lot of bumblebee species, the way we differentiate workers and females is based on their body size. So the queen bumblebee, or sorry, workers and queens, they're all females. The queen bumblebees tend to be a lot larger than the workers. Workers are little, more comparable in size to the males generally, or even smaller. So when we're going through and identifying your submissions to Bumblebee Watch, what we're mostly queuing in on is the size of the bees. And then there are sometimes some differences in color patterns between the queens and the workers, but generally females tend to have similar color patterns for queens and workers, no matter what species you're looking at.
Another question here that says, is it only the queen that survives the winter? Yes, that is correct. So at the end of the summer, that bumblebee colony will start producing new queens and males. And those new queens that are produced at the end of the season are then the ones that go and survive the winter and then start a new colony the following spring.
So this question asks, does that mean we're unlikely to see males in the spring? Short answer is yes, at least for Missouri. But when you start thinking about spring, like we'll start seeing two-spot bumblebee males sometimes in June, like mid-June, early June. So when I say unlikely, yes, it is unlikely that you'll see them, but there's also a chance if a colony fails early, sometimes those eggs can turn into males, or if a queen is unmated and she goes and overwinters, she'll only be able to produce males. So it's very unlikely that you'll find males early spring, but there's a little bit of leeway in that.
Yeah, there's another question that just came in that says, do different species of bumblebees have certain months where they are more active? Which is a good segue from what Jared was just talking about. So different species, sort of their colony cycles are on different schedules. So like the two-spotted bumblebee, their populations peak much earlier in the season. So they're producing those males earlier, where other bumblebees, like the common eastern bumblebee, their colony sizes peak much later in the season. And you'll see common eastern bumblebee males into October. So definitely there is some variation in seasonality there. And
I
the
see
other, Other
Totally.
unanswered question I see is, does a queen ever overwinter in a nest used that summer? Not quite. So the queens dig themselves down a couple inches into the soil into something that's called a hibernaculum. So they won't overwinter in their maternal nest, but it has been documented that they will overwinter very, very close to their maternal nest. So they won't be in that nest that they came from, but they might be very close by. As part of the Bumblebee Atlas, and usually in April, we always do a webinar about bumblebee ecology and conservation. So for folks that have more questions about kind of the ecology side of things, we go over all of that. And our recording from that webinar from earlier this year is available on YouTube, and I think it's on the Bumblebee Atlas website as well.
Yes, it is. Yeah. All right, we have just one more minute left, so I do want to use that to just once again reiterate, thank you all so much for being here with us today. We really appreciate your interest in these topics, and we will hopefully see you all next week for our second webinar covering some of the bumblebees that have red patterns on them and the mostly yellow bumblebees. All right, and with that, we will say goodbye. Thank you, everybody.